Before we begin, if you believe in stories that reveal truth, courage, and the hidden battles shaping our world, then make sure to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe for more powerful documentaries. Today's story is not just history, it's a revelation. It's about a young soldier who defied the world's strongest powers, exposed shadows no one dared to confront, and crushed a terror threat that was meant to break his people forever. This is the day Burkina Faso changed everything. This is the turning point. The night was heavy with smoke. In the northern villages of Burkina Faso, silence had become a stranger. Gunfire crackled through the horizon like thunder. Houses collapsed in flames, and children screamed into the void of a desert that seemed to swallow hope whole. A new wave of terror had arrived. Ruthless, faceless, unrelenting, they struck markets at dawn, schools at dusk, mosques during prayer. Terrorism wasn't just an enemy, it was an atmosphere, a suffocating shadow that smothered everything alive. But far from the burning villages, in polished rooms lit by golden chandeliers, two men sat oceans apart yet bound by a single fear. One in Washington, one in Moscow. Trump and Putin, two names that carried weight, each a master of manipulation. Yet here, in secret, they shared a rare alignment. Ibrahim Traoré, he was too young, too bold, too dangerous to their designs. A soldier who dared to defy superpowers, a leader who dared to claim Africa's right to rise. And now he stood on the edge of crushing the terror networks they had quietly nurtured for years. If Traoré succeeded, the myth of dependence would shatter. If Burkina Faso could face terror without bending to giants, then what excuse would remain for the rest of Africa? A choice was made in those hidden chambers. Whispers of betrayal, promises of destruction, plans that would see Traoré broken, humiliated, erased. But as they conspired, a storm was building in Ouagadougou, and within it, Ibrahim Traoré was preparing to uncover a darkness greater than terrorism itself. What he discovered next would shake the world. Ibrahim Traoré's rise was not scripted in luxury or comfort. It was carved out of hunger and blood. Born into a land that had long been starved of justice, he knew the weight of emptiness before he knew the meaning of power. Burkina Faso was a nation scarred. Fields once golden were abandoned, livestock stolen, rivers poisoned with grief. Every week brought news of another village leveled, another family displaced, another mother searching for her child among ashes. The world called it terrorism. But for those who lived it, it was something crueler, an endless eclipse of hope. Traoré emerged not as a politician, but as a soldier who had marched those same barren roads, who had lifted the wounded with his own hands. He carried the legacy of Thomas Sankara not as a banner but as a wound, an unhealed reminder that Africa's dream of independence had been betrayed once before. As he rose to lead, three truths weighed on him. Terrorism was growing, not shrinking. Foreign aid always came with chains. The survival of his people demanded choices that no leader had ever dared to make. But as his people looked to him with fragile hope, shadows moved beyond their borders. In Moscow, Putin saw Africa as his chessboard. Access to gold, uranium, and influence, all crucial to his empire's survival. Traoré was unpredictable, unwilling to bend, and therefore dangerous. In Washington, Trump saw opportunity in chaos. His private networks, mercenary groups, and corporate backers whispered promises. Destabilization meant profit. And so, in separate rooms, two men who rarely agreed found themselves united in quiet resolve. Ibrahim Traoré had to be stopped. Meanwhile, the desert whispered with new names. Three masked figures, known only by their code names, the Viper, the Jackal, and the Phantom, were rising as the heads of terrorist networks sweeping across the Sahel. No one knew where their funding came from. But their weapons were too modern, their coordination too sharp, to be born of dust and anger alone. Villages fell one after another. Mothers walked barefoot for miles, cradling lifeless children. Soldiers grew weary, their eyes hollow, their rifles heavier than their will. And every night, Ibrahim stood at his desk, staring at maps painted red with suffering, asking himself the same question. How do you fight an enemy that wears no face? Yet deep down he sensed something even darker. The pieces didn't fit. The scale of the terror, the speed of its spread, the sophistication of its tactics. They carried fingerprints of design. Not chaos, not faith, but calculation. And so began the journey into shadows, where Traoré would learn that terrorism was not merely the hand that held the knife, but the invisible hand that paid for the blade. What he didn't know yet was that the trail would lead him straight into the crosshairs of the world's most powerful men. The dry season came early. Fields cracked under the sun's punishment, and harvests withered before they touched the hands of the hungry. In the north, villages emptied, their people marching in lines of dust toward camps that promised shelter but delivered despair. The enemy knew when to strike. As hunger grew, so did the attacks. Convoys carrying grain were ambushed, wells poisoned, roads turned into death traps. Terrorism wasn't just killing, it was starving Burkina Faso into silence. But Ibrahim Traoré refused to surrender. Each day he rode out to his people, his uniform covered in sweat and dust, his presence a promise that he would not hide behind walls. His soldiers drew courage from him, but courage alone could not fill an empty stomach. In the barracks, soldiers murmured about betrayal. Weapons meant for them never arrived. Fuel disappeared before reaching the front lines. A convoy carrying medical aid vanished without a trace. The desert had swallowed supplies too many times for coincidence. At night, Traoré spread maps across his table, candles burning low as his eyes scanned the reports. The evidence was undeniable. Someone inside his ranks was feeding the enemy. Far beyond Ouagadougou, the game was unfolding. In Moscow, Putin studied photographs of burning villages, intercepted communications, and reports of division within the Burkina Faso army. Pressure was his weapon. Offer help, but with conditions, he commanded coldly. To him, terror was not the problem, it was leverage. In Washington, Trump huddled with contractors and businessmen. They weren't wearing flags, but they carried contracts and promises. Drones, mercenaries, logistics, all for sale. Chaos is opportunity, he told them. And Africa is ripe for business. Both leaders, oceans apart, saw the same solution. Keep Traoré weak, cornered, desperate enough to bend. Meanwhile, the terror grew sharper. Villages fell overnight. Fighters appeared with weapons too modern for black markets, their tactics too refined for tribal insurgents. RPGs and encrypted radios flowed into the desert as if conjured from thin air. The masked figures known only as the Viper, the Jackal, and the Phantom haunted the land like specters. They struck without warning, melted into the desert, then reappeared with greater fury. One night, a refugee camp near Kaya was attacked. Families fled through fire, children clutched in shaking arms. Soldiers found rows of bodies under the moonlight, and beside them, stones arranged into a chilling message. Your leader cannot protect you. The terror was no longer random. It was psychological warfare, designed to break a nation's spirit. In the capital, the dossier arrived. Coded messages intercepted within Traoré's inner circle, matched transmissions traced to terrorist frequencies. A high-ranking advisor, someone trusted, was feeding maps, schedules, and supply routes directly to the enemy. The revelation cut deeper than any bullet, but Traoré held his silence. To move too soon would risk tearing his fragile unity apart. To delay might doom his country, so he let the traitor believe the secret was safe. Beyond his palace walls, despair grew heavier. Mothers staggered into the city with empty bowls, their children too weak to cry. Soldiers returned from the field with hollow eyes, their rifles heavier than their hope. Markets fell silent at dusk. Fear itself had become a currency. Yet Traoré walked among them. He listened without speeches, his silence stronger than words. His people clung to him because he carried their pain like armor. Still, the pressure pressed harder. The world was certain Burkina Faso could not survive without foreign chains. That no small nation could defeat the terror bleeding across the Sahel. That no young leader could resist the will of giants. But he remembered Sankara's warning. He who feeds you controls you. And so he refused foreign boots, refused foreign chains. The cost of that defiance, however, was growing unbearable. Late one night, an interrogation broke open a darker truth. A captured radio operator admitted that terrorist weapons were not hidden in desert caches. They were delivered in sealed containers marked as humanitarian aid. The paperwork traced back to Western contractors and Russian mercenaries alike. The mask had slipped. Terrorism in Burkina Faso was not an accident of the desert. It was engineered, exported, delivered by the very powers that claimed to bring order. When emissaries from both Moscow and Washington arrived, their offers carried the same poisoned sweetness. Accept our protection. Open your doors. Let us fight your war. They promised weapons, stability, survival. But Traoré saw the trap. The disease had been created by the very hands that now offered the cure. If he said yes, his people might live, but as slaves. If he said no, they might not live at all. The silence of that moment was crushing. He could hear the distant cries of his people outside, and within his own walls, he felt the cold breath of betrayal watching him. He clenched his fists and whispered to the memory of Sankara and to the ancestors who had endured chains before him. We will not bow. The trap tightened. Terror attacks escalated. Hunger deepened. Betrayal grew bolder. Putin's men and Trump's contractors lurked, waiting for him to fall. But Ibrahim Traoré did not break. He sharpened. Quietly, he began to prepare his people for a fight that would be theirs alone. Soldiers were drilled to fight harder. Farmers were taught to defend their fields, women to guard their homes, and children to carry stories of resistance. The war was no longer only in the desert. It was in every village, every street, every heart, and in the shadows. The Viper, the Jackal, and the Phantom planned their boldest strike yet. The world's most powerful men were watching. The enemy was closing in from within and without. And Ibrahim Traoré, standing against famine, betrayal, and giants, was preparing for the turning point that would decide the fate of his nation, and perhaps the fate of Africa itself. The air over Ouagadougou thickened with dread before the first shot was fired. In the weeks leading up to it, the city had lived in uneasy silence, like a drum stretched tight, waiting for the strike that would split it open. Markets grew emptier by the day, checkpoints heavier with suspicion. Mothers whispered prayers over their children's beds, uncertain if the dawn would bring safety or smoke, and then it began. Before sunrise, the capital trembled. A wave of explosions thundered in the northern districts. Columns of fire rose into the pale sky, and gunfire echoed through the narrow streets. Terrorists had breached the outskirts of the city, hundreds of them, armed with weapons too precise, too well supplied, to be born of desperation. The Viper, the Jackal, and the Phantom had united their forces for one decisive blow. It was no mere raid. It was a siege. From rooftops, snipers rained bullets onto soldiers scrambling for cover. From alleys, suicide trucks roared forward, detonating at barricades. Panic rippled through the population as families fled, clutching what little they could carry. The sky filled with smoke, blotting out the morning sun, and the capital descended into chaos. Inside the presidential compound, Ibrahim Traoré stood at a window, watching flames lick the skyline. Around him, generals shouted into radios, their voices tangled with static and fear. Reports poured in, positions overrun, regiments cut off, civilians trapped. The enemy was everywhere, like a storm with no center. Yet beneath the panic, Traoré's mind sharpened. He had expected this moment. He knew the assault would come, though not its scale. What unsettled him most was not the ferocity of the enemy, but the timing. The attack was too precise, too perfectly aimed at the city's weak points. It bore the mark of inside knowledge. He turned, his eyes scanning the faces of the men around him. Somewhere in this room, he thought, the traitor was smiling. Hours stretched like centuries. Street by street, the battle raged. Soldiers fought not only to hold ground, but to keep civilians alive. Farmers who had never fired a weapon took up arms beside them. Women turned their homes into shelters, their doorways into barricades. The city became a living fortress, each corner holding its breath, each wall echoing with defiance. But the enemy was relentless. By midday, the presidential compound itself came under assault. Mortar shells crashed against its walls, shaking the ground beneath Traoré's feet. Dust fell from the ceiling. His commanders begged him to evacuate, to flee to a safer position, but he refused. If I run, he thought, The nation falls with me. It was then, amid the chaos, that the betrayal revealed itself. An intercepted transmission exposed the truth. One of his own senior advisors had been guiding the terrorists' movements, feeding them the army's defenses in real time. The message had been sent only minutes before, its code traced to a device inside the compound itself. The walls that protected him were bleeding treachery. Traoré felt the weight of betrayal sink into his chest, but he did not allow it to show. He summoned the traitor quietly, his voice steady, his gaze burning with restrained fury. The man entered, unaware his secret had been uncovered. For a brief moment, the world seemed to stop. The smoke outside, the gunfire, the screams, all drowned in the silence between them. When the truth came crashing down, it was swift, merciless, irreversible. The traitor's mask was stripped, his betrayal laid bare before the very soldiers he had doomed. Gasps filled the room, followed by rage. Justice was carried out not with hesitation, but with the certainty of survival. The man who had sold his nation's blood would betray no more. Outside, the siege intensified. The terrorists pushed closer to the heart of the city. Putin's mercenaries lingered beyond the borders, waiting for the collapse. Trump's contractors circled, offering help if Traoré would only surrender control. The vultures were ready to descend, but Traoré's refusal hardened into defiance. He rallied his commanders, his soldiers, his people. He spoke not of surrender, but of survival, not of fear, but of fire. His words spread through radios and loudspeakers, carried into the streets where ordinary citizens fought shoulder to shoulder with the army. This is our city. This is our land. Stand, and it will stand with you. The tide began to shift. By late afternoon, the battle raged at the very gates of the compound. Waves of fighters hurled themselves against the barricades, but each time they were driven back by the fury of defenders who no longer fought for orders but for existence itself. Farmers wielded machetes beside rifles. Women carried ammunition to the front lines. Children shouted warnings of enemy movements through the streets. The capital had become an organism of resistance, and then came the moment that changed everything. The Phantom himself appeared on the battlefield, leading a column of fighters into the heart of the city. His presence ignited fear. Stories had painted him as invincible, a ghost who could not be killed. But Traoré saw not a phantom, but a man cloaked in myth, and myths could bleed. As night fell, the confrontation reached its peak. The compound's last defenses held against wave after wave, each clash shaking the city like thunder. Smoke and fire painted the sky red, turning night into a nightmare of flame. Inside the compound, Traoré stood unyielding. His uniform was torn, his hands blackened with dust and ash, but his eyes burned with the fire of a people who refused chains. The enemy had thrown everything at him: terrorists, famine, betrayal, and the weight of superpowers. Yet he still stood. And when the Phantom's forces finally faltered, when the myth began to crack under the weight of defiance, a roar rose from the city. It was not the cry of an army, nor the shout of a commander. It was the voice of a nation, carrying through the smoke, echoing off the broken walls. The terrorists began to break. Their lines faltered. Their confidence dissolved. One by one, they fell back, retreating into the night, their shadows swallowed by the very desert that had birthed them. The capital still burned. Bodies still lay in the streets. The scars of the siege would never fully heal. But when dawn broke, Burkina Faso still stood. And in that fragile dawn, as smoke curled upward like a prayer, the world realized what had just happened. Against the impossible, against betrayal, against the secret designs of giants, Ibrahim Traoré and his people had crushed the terror that was meant to break them forever. But as the dust settled, one question remained, whispered in fear across Moscow and Washington. If he could survive this, what else could he do? When the final gunshots faded, silence fell heavy over Ouagadougou. It was not the silence of peace, but the stunned quiet of a city that had survived the unthinkable. Smoke curled above shattered buildings, streets were littered with the wreckage of war, and families crept from their hiding places, blinking into the fragile light of a new dawn. The capital still stood. And with it, so did hope. For days, the smell of burned earth and blood lingered in the air. Volunteers worked tirelessly to clear rubble, to dig survivors from beneath collapsed walls, to bury the fallen with honor. Soldiers who had fought through the night stood side by side with civilians, their uniforms stained with the same dust, their faces marked by the same exhaustion. Mothers cooked for entire battalions, strangers embraced like kin, and prayers rose from every corner of the city. Traoré walked among them, not hidden behind armored cars or distant balconies, but on foot, his boots sinking into the same ash as his people. He carried no speeches written on paper. His presence was the message. In his eyes, the nation saw not a ruler, but a man who had chosen to stand, bleed, and fight with them. And word spread. Within days, villages across Burkina Faso lit fires in celebration. From the northern Sahel to the southern farmlands, communities that had once trembled under the shadow of terrorism raised their voices in defiance. Songs were sung, drums beaten, and the names of the fallen turned into hymns. Children who had lived their short lives in fear now shouted freely in the streets. The darkness had not disappeared, but it had been pierced. Beyond Burkina Faso's borders, the world reacted with disbelief. In Moscow, Vladimir Putin was briefed on the battle's outcome. His advisors spoke carefully, avoiding the word failure, but the humiliation was plain. His mercenaries had lingered, waiting for collapse, yet collapse never came. Instead, the terrorists, forces Moscow quietly hoped would pressure Traoré, were shattered. Putin clenched his jaw as he realized that his attempt to test Burkina Faso's resolve had backfired. In the eyes of Africa, Russia's silence in Burkina Faso's darkest hour was proof of indifference, not friendship. Across the Atlantic, Donald Trump's private contractors seethed. They had promised quick salvation, whispered offers of guns, helicopters, and specialists in exchange for lucrative contracts and influence. But Traoré had rejected them. He had chosen resistance over dependency, and now, in the aftermath, Trump's men looked not like saviors, but like opportunists left empty-handed. Washington and Paris watched with their own quiet alarm. A dangerous precedent had been set. For decades, Africa had been painted as dependent on aid, on foreign militaries, on outside stability. But Burkina Faso had rewritten the story. A small nation, cornered and bleeding, had stood without leaning on superpowers, and survived. This was more than a battle. It was a declaration. In Bamako, in Niamey, in Conakry, leaders whispered that if Burkina Faso could defy the odds, perhaps they could too. Youth across the Sahel painted murals of Traoré with fire in his eyes, a red beret tilted defiantly, his silhouette rising like a shield against the storm. Hashtags flooded social media, carrying messages of African unity and self-reliance. Burkina Faso, once spoken of in pity, was now spoken of in reverence. But even victory came with scars. The capital had bled. Entire neighborhoods lay in ruins. Thousands were displaced. Graves stretched across the countryside. The cost of defiance was etched into every broken wall, every empty chair at the dinner table. Traoré knew this. And in the quiet after the battle, when the cheering had softened into mourning, he stood before his people and spoke not of triumph but of responsibility. "We have defended our land," he said, his voice echoing through the capital square. "But victory is not survival alone. We must rebuild not just our homes but our spirit. Terror has been driven back, but its shadow lingers. Let us prove that Burkina Faso does not simply endure. Burkina Faso creates. Burkina Faso rises." The crowd erupted, not with wild celebration, but with steady, grounded resolve. It was the sound of a people not blinded by victory, but strengthened by it. International media scrambled to explain what had happened. Headlines called it the miracle of Ouagadougou, the day Africa defied terror, the stand that changed the Sahel. Analysts debated how a nation with limited resources could repel such a coordinated assault. They overlooked one truth. Weapons can be bought, strategies can be borrowed, but unity cannot be imposed from outside. Burkina Faso's strength had come from within, yet for every headline, there was also fear. Western think tanks warned that Traoré was growing too powerful, too inspiring, The idea of an Africa that looked inward rather than outward was dangerous to those who had long profited from dependency. The whispers of sanctions grew louder. Political analysts predicted instability, but the people of Burkina Faso had stopped listening to predictions. They had written their own. Weeks later, in a modest ceremony beneath the open sky, the fallen were honored. Thousands gathered, each face lit by flickering torches. Names were read, one by one, echoing into the night. Children released lanterns into the sky, their lights rising like souls toward the heavens. And as the last name faded into silence, the crowd raised a single unified chant. Burkina Faso lives! It carried across the plains, over the rivers, into the ears of allies and enemies alike. And somewhere in the shadows of the desert, the remnants of the terrorist alliance, the Viper's men, the Jackal's raiders, the Phantom's ghosts, trembled. They had thrown everything at the capital and failed. Their myth of invincibility had cracked. Recruitment slowed. Fear shifted. The hunters had become the hunted. For Traoré, the battle was not the end, but the beginning. He knew the terrorists would regroup, that foreign powers would sharpen their knives, that the scars of war would not heal overnight. But he also knew something greater had been born: belief. A people who once looked outward for salvation had discovered their own strength, and that was a weapon no enemy could disarm. The story of Burkina Faso's stand traveled far beyond its borders. In dusty villages across Africa, young boys wore red berets with pride. In cities from Dakar to Dar es Salaam, murals bloomed across walls, painted with the words, "Africa is not weak. Africa is rising." And in the quiet chambers of power where leaders schemed and empires plotted, one unsettling truth echoed like a warning bell. If Burkina Faso could do this alone, what would happen if Africa stood together? The world did not return to silence after Burkina Faso's stand. The echoes of that night, the gunfire, the courage, the unyielding resistance, continued to reverberate across continents, carried not just by news broadcasts, but by whispers in markets, classrooms, and hidden gatherings. In Africa's villages, where stories were still told by firelight, elders spoke of Traoré's defiance as if it were myth, placing him beside Sankara, Lumumba, and Nkrumah. Children who once grew up fearing the sound of gunfire now grew up dreaming of courage. They no longer asked, "Who will save us?" but "What can we become?" And that shift was the true victory. Terrorism, though bloodied, was not gone. Shadows still lingered in deserts and forests, knives still glinted in the night. But the myth of invincibility, the idea that the people of Burkina Faso would always bow, was gone forever. Terrorism could no longer claim inevitability, and that made it mortal. The foreign powers, too, felt the shift. In Washington, think tanks scrambled to redefine Africa. In Moscow, silence became strategy. In Paris, anger simmered, as officials quietly admitted that their grip on the Sahel was weakening. But none could undo the image now carved into history. A small, battered nation refusing to break, led not by a puppet of global powers, but by a man who chose unity over submission. What frightened them most was not Traoré's victory, but what it symbolized. For decades, the world had thrived on a simple equation: Africa divided, Africa dependent, Africa desperate. But Burkina Faso had disrupted the pattern. If one nation could break the cycle, others might follow. Already murmurs spread. In Mali, youth movements rose, chanting for sovereignty. In Guinea, workers marched with flags painted in defiant colors. In Niger, whispers of rebellion turned into songs of resistance. Across the continent, a generation stirred, no longer satisfied with borrowed solutions and broken promises. For Traoré, the weight of victory was heavy. He walked not as a man unscathed, but as one marked by loss. His people looked to him not only as a leader, but as a symbol, and symbols carry burdens greater than crowns. In the nights after the battle, he sat alone in his office, candlelight flickering across maps stained with notes and scars. He knew the terrorists would return, and he knew the superpowers would not forgive. Yet he also knew that something deeper had been born. For the first time in decades, Africans looked to themselves, not to Moscow, not to Washington, not to Paris, for salvation. And in that awakening lay a strength no army could suppress. The moral of Burkina Faso's defiance was not that a single man could change history, but that a people united could. The lessons were simple, yet profound. First, terror thrives on fear, but fear can be broken. When ordinary men and women refused to bow, the machinery of terror began to crumble. Second, superpowers lose their grip when their myths are exposed. The night Ouagadougou stood without foreign soldiers shattered the illusion that Africa's survival depended on outsiders. Third, unity is the greatest weapon. Guns and money can be stolen, but the will of a people bound by purpose cannot be bought or broken. And finally, every turning point is a beginning, not an end. Burkina Faso's stand was not the final chapter, but the first line of a new story, a story Africa would write for itself. The candlelight of hope, once nearly extinguished, now flickered in countless corners of the continent. Years from now, children would ask where they were on the day Burkina Faso crushed the terror threat. Some would remember hiding in the dark, others fighting in the streets, others burying their dead. But all would remember one truth: their nation had not surrendered. And when the world asked how, their answer would not be about strategy or weapons. It would be about courage, about a young soldier who refused to kneel, about a people who chose to rise, about a night when everything seemed lost, and yet was won. The battle became more than history. It became myth, prophecy, and warning. To enemies it whispered, Africa is no longer asleep. To friends it promised, Africa's future belongs to Africa and to the people themselves. It thundered, if we stood once, we can stand again. So the question lingered, carried by winds across deserts and oceans. A question both haunting and hopeful. Was this the turning point, not just for Burkina Faso, but for Africa itself? Was this the day the continent, long divided and diminished, finally began to rise? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain. When the world thought Burkina Faso would break, it did not. And in that defiance lay the seed of a revolution that no empire could control. The story was no longer theirs to dictate. It was Africa's.